Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Kate Morales, and I am the Policy Director for the Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus for Public Health. Today's webinar is on advocating for Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander data disaggregation. Before we get started, just a few points on how to participate in the webinar. Due to the number of attendees, you are muted during the session. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the question box in your control panel, and I will be monitoring them as they come in, so feel free to type them in at any time, and then we will read the questions out at the end of all of the presentations. And this webinar is being recorded, and we will share a copy of the presentation slides as well as recording of the presentations on APIC's website after the webinar. So this webinar is being presented by APIC. APIC is the voice and vision for Asian and Pacific Islander public health and health equity. Our mission is to advance the health and health equity of Asian and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. as well as associated jurisdictions and diaspora. And we are in affiliation with the American Public Health Association. Just a plug to join APIC, if you're not a member, membership in the caucus is free. It's open to those interested in addressing public health issues affecting Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. For information on how to join APIC, you can contact our APIC membership chair at membership@apicaucus.org. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lon Doan, who's our co-director for APIC's RWJF Award for Health Equity. Lon?
Hi, everyone. As Kate mentioned, I am one of the co-directors for the Robert Wood Johnson Award for Health Equity. The purpose of this award is to recognize individuals who have made outstanding contributions towards achieving health equity. So this is a 7-year program, and we are currently in the 3rd year of this awards program. What we're looking for is nominations for individuals who have successfully implemented a systems change, and examples of the systems change might be in one or more of the following areas: access to quality care, education, employment, income, community environment, housing, and this individual would have provided a solution or approach to improve outcomes for groups most affected by health disparities. So this is a slide just to advertise that this call for nominations will open on June 1st of this year. And more information about instructions, application form is available. But in the meanwhile, if you have any questions, you are free to email us about the award or eligibility. And we look forward to reviewing everyone's application. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lon. All right, we'll go ahead and jump right into today's presentations. And we're going to introduce all of our panelists at once. So our moderator for today's discussion is Dr. Tung Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen is a professor of medicine at the University of California in San Francisco School of Medicine, and he's also director of the Asian American Research Center on Health, or ARCH, which has over 40 individual and organizational members dedicated to improving the health of Asian Americans. Dr. Nguyen also previously served as chair of President Barack Obama's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And our speakers today, our first speaker will be Dr. Karthik Ramakrishnan, who's the Associate Dean at the University of California, Riverside School of Public Policy. He's also director and founder of the Center for Social Innovation. Dr. Ramakrishnan's research focuses on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race, ethnicity, and immigration in the U.S. He also directs the National Asian American Survey and is the founder of APIC.com, which we'll be hearing more about today. And then following Dr. Ramakrishnan is Ann John. Ann is the Senior Policy Strategist at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. Prior to working at the Health Forum, Ann worked as a policy analyst for the Maryland Office of Minority Health and Health Disparities at the Department of Mental Health and Mental Hygiene. Then we will have Wayne Ye, who is the coordinator for the Asian Pacific Islander Civic Action Network in Massachusetts. He's also the Civic Action Organizer for Chinese Progressive Association based in Boston, Massachusetts. And then finally, Suvan Lee will wrap up, and he is the policy advocate at the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. Suvan leads CRAC's state and federal education policy and program initiatives. He has advocated for state and federal data disaggregation legislation and the Every Student Succeeds Act that created the first data disaggregation federal grant at the U.S. Department of Education. So we look forward to hearing from everyone today, and thank you all for joining. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Nguyen.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to the API Caucus for organizing this, and in advance, thank you to all of our speakers for the information and presenting. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on disaggregated data and APIs. As the moderator, my job is first to introduce the topic before turning it over to the experts. I've had some experience with disaggregated data myself as both a researcher in Asian American health and as a physician who takes care of many different Asian patients from different nationalities. Briefly, when I was chair of President Obama's Advisory Commission on APIs, disaggregated data was always the #1 policy priority in all the conversation we had with all federal agencies. My understanding is that the current White House initiative on APIs continues to emphasize the importance of disaggregated data for our populations, speaking to the importance of this issue beyond political lines. So why do we need disaggregated data? There are 3 major reasons and of course many other smaller ones. First, for APIs, one of the most important reasons is that aggregated data cannot accurately capture our people, since the API label covers people from over 30 countries, each with its own culture, history, and immigration patterns, as well as different types of health indices and behaviors. So for us to help ourselves and for others to help us, we need accurate data so that we can identify problems and tailor our solutions. The second major reason is that when viewed in aggregate, APIs may look better on some metrics, particularly with regard to health compared to other racial and ethnic groups. This leads to the misleading impression from the model minority myth that we don't suffer from disparities and lead to lack of resources allocated to address these issues within our own communities and from policymakers. Examples of this include liver cancer disparities among Southeast Asians and cardiovascular health disparities among Filipinos and South Asians. The third key reason is one of visibility. When we are counted, it is an indication that we count. On a personal level, I wanted to become a researcher because the lack of disaggregated data for Vietnamese Americans made me want to do more work in it. And I'm only successful as a researcher because policy led to disaggregated data collection for cancer, which enabled me to obtain funding to address issues like cervical and liver cancer disparities among Vietnamese Americans. Now, despite all of these reasons, and the number of people working on them in our communities, research, and policy arena, we still don't have enough disaggregated data. Even during the Obama administration, we celebrated small victories like the Labor Department issuing its first and only report to date on APIs that was disaggregated. And it appears that not only are we not going forward fast enough, we may be going backwards. For example, we are very concerned about the threats to the most fundamental instrument of disaggregated API data collection, which is the US Census coming up in 2020. And equally disturbing is the increasing visibility of some Asian Americans who are arguing for less disaggregated data, which is a relatively new phenomenon. So that is why we're having this discussion today. So to start, I'd like to hand this over to Professor Karthik Ramakrishnan to talk in more detail about disaggregated data. Karthik?
Thank you, Tung. And thank you to Kate and everyone else for organizing this. And I will try to go through my slides fairly quickly, give a little bit more detail to what Tung had flagged. First, I'll just say a little bit about API data. What is API data? Our goal simply is to make data and research on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders more accessible to a broad array of audiences. So we started in 2013. So after the 2012 election, we found that there was a lot of interest, especially among journalists, to find out not only about how Asian Americans were voting, So there's always a lot of interest around election season, and for our National Asian American Survey, we found interest more generally on API populations, and we thought that it would be important to set up a centralized resource that can serve as a data portal to research that academics as well as nonprofit organizations have done on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I'll just highlight a couple of resources on our site that have been recently developed that are relevant for this conversation. Next slide, please. So first is a community facts tool that it's had different iterations. Just a month ago, if you clicked on community facts from our main site, you would have seen PDFs of fact sheets that we developed with the Center for American Progress. We also did an in-depth report, a comprehensive report, I should say, not in-depth per se, but a comprehensive report with Center for American Progress on various indicators related to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. What we have now is we've developed essentially a shiny app, which will allow you to choose different populations and get basic indicators at the national level. So you can choose up to 3 populations and to compare them side by side. And this really shows the power of data disaggregation on outcomes like educational attainment and even health insurance. You'll see differences across populations. Next slide. We also created a microsite specifically to get people quicker access to various posts that we have, where we refer to resources that we and others have developed on data disaggregation. We call it Ethnicity Data because we think it's a simpler way to try to have the general public understand what this means beyond the experts within the API community or some of the activists on this issue. Next slide. And we have many infographics, which is our bread and butter at API Data. We find that most people don't have the time or perhaps the expertise to wade through journal articles or even multi-page reports that we or others put out. So we do a lot of social media work through infographics that people are free to use. And indeed, we find our infographics showing up in all sorts of people's PowerPoint presentations, which we welcome. So people are free to use whatever we have on our website as long as they keep the credit to API Data. So if you look at educational attainment, this is one of those slides that we see time and again where the power of data disaggregation is so readily apparent. Next slide. You can also see it with limited English proficiency. This is one of the things that either skeptics or advocates against data disaggregation say, why is this so important to Asians? Well, language access is one of the most powerful reasons why we need data disaggregation, because you have tremendous language needs, and you can't know what that particular language need might be unless you have data disaggregation. Next slide. Health insurance, which a lot of people on this call would care about, also varies greatly across Asian ethnicities. Next slide. And it also varies for different Pacific Islander groups. So whenever possible, it is also important to not only break out Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, but to be able to separate out the various Pacific Islander populations. Next slide. So given all of this, given that this has been a priority not only for the White House Commission under the Obama administration, but for community organizations for over 3 decades, it's come as a bit of a surprise that there is opposition to data disaggregation. Where this became prominent nationally was related to protests against a data disaggregation bill that became law in Rhode Island last summer. Next slide. And this was disheartening for a lot of people, not only within the Asian American movement, but also long-standing researchers who rely on detailed and accurate data in order to identify communities and populations of need. This protest is something that we had seen in California before. So in California, we had AB 726, which then later became AB 1726, and this was a data disaggregation bill championed by Ron Batta. It was also championed by the California Commission on APIA Affairs, and for full disclosure, I served on the commission at the time, I chair the commission now, and when the first data disaggregation bill went through, there was no opposition to it. It passed nearly unanimously in both chambers of the California legislature. Everyone thought it was a no-brainer, but Jerry Brown vetoed it for reasons that are not that clear. But what that did is once Jerry Brown vetoed it and it was going to get brought up in the subsequent legislative session, that gave oxygen to the opposition. And you had partisan legislators, including those that are not APIs, but partisan ones, telling Chinese immigrant communities that this was a way to try to bring affirmative action back into California. There had been a prior fight over affirmative action, and even though data disaggregation has nothing to do with affirmative action, you started seeing political demagoguery on it, and that is the playbook that is now being used throughout various states in the country. Next slide. And things have gotten so bad. We're gonna hear more about the Massachusetts experience, but they've spread to other states, including in Connecticut. And for the first time ever, we've seen Asian elected officials using, essentially, I'll just call it out, using propagandistic terms like Asian Registry to push back against data disaggregation, instead of trying to dispel the propaganda and the rhetoric on this, riding that wave for political gain. And this is something that is now threatening the US Census as well. We are now starting to see conservatives, largely Chinese immigrant conservatives, mobilizing in a platform called WeChat, which is a highly addictive social media platform, much more addictive than Facebook, and much more comprehensive in its scope. So people not only connect with each other, they engage commercial transactions and build communities that have both a real-world connection as well as a virtual connection, and it is a very strong organizing tool within the Chinese immigrant community. So this notion of an Asian registry has gained a lot of circulation in those circles and is now popping up. And now we're seeing activists trying to push back against this notion of an Asian registry for the 2020 census. Next slide, please. And just like we've seen mass protests at the state capitol in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, we are also now seeing it in Minnesota. Minnesota has a law in place on data disaggregation, but the conservative Chinese immigrant community, some people call it the Chinese Tea Party, have been mobilizing, and they've been very entrepreneurial in how they mobilize through a shock and awe strategy to intimidate champions of accurate data collection. And so what's going on right now in Minnesota is you have activists that are trying to prevent implementation of the law and dilute implementation of the law. One of the strategies they're pushing is for Chinese immigrants to not even check off the Chinese box, which we think is very harmful for the very communities they think that they're advocating for or defending. Next slide. And what this has also done is it's started to normalize racism within our community. So in Sacramento this year, just a few months ago, you had a high school student project in a gifted and talented program suggesting that Southeast Asians had a lower IQ than Northeast Asians. This is the first time we have heard the term Northeast Asians. And it's largely a byproduct of this kind of toxic atmosphere within the Asian community, with a very well-organized conservative vanguard using propaganda to attack data disaggregation. Next slide. There's some important lessons here, and I know I'm running out of time, but we have to not see this just as an academic issue. For better or worse, this has become a very visible and public issue that we have to engage in. And we have to learn from some of the tactics that the opposition is using, because this is not purely about making sure that the facts are known. We are living in a world of propaganda where it's not just about evidence, but also about emotion, about values, about identities being engaged. Next slide. I've been very active on social media. If anyone here on the call is a Facebook friend of mine, I do a lot of work on Facebook. So I've been trying to sound the alarm on not only on data disaggregation, but the kind of asymmetric mobilization that's happening within our community, with some very loud activists intimidating public officials, intimidating nonprofits. When I posted one of these things on my wall, Judge Mike Kwan of Utah put it perfectly, and you can I don't want to repeat what he's saying, but essentially to try to remind people why we do data disaggregation in the first place. Next slide. And so there's some important lessons learned here in terms of how we message on this issue, how we engage on this issue. We cannot simply take it for granted that because we've been pushing this for over 30 years that everyone's going to understand why data disaggregation is important. So it becomes a messaging and framing activity, I would say even more so than a research activity, because the research is very solid here. But there's a big disconnect between what the research says and what some propagandists are doing right now within our communities. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to say that whenever we talk about data disaggregation, in fact, one of the arguments that Jerry Brown made in his veto statement was that we should not be unnecessarily dividing the community, that it weakens the community politically. It's strange because this is one of the highest priorities for the community itself. And in fact, it is not inconsistent to say that we need to disaggregate while we're building political power for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And that is because we draw strength from our diversity. And so I'll just end with with a few examples of API heroes who have been very important to the struggle. And instead of thinking of diversity as something that divides us, as something that weakens us in terms of our collective impact, we need to look at the heroes and sheroes in all aspects of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities to draw strength and to redouble our efforts in the fight. I think that's it. I think that's all my slides.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you for laying it out very clearly what the current issues are in terms of both why it's important that we advocate for this disaggregation and why there are people within our own community resisting it and sort of laying out what we need to do to go forward. Directly related to that, we'll move into the next presentation, which is Ian on federal advocacy overview and current efforts at the federal level. Ian?
Thanks, Tim. So again, my name is Ian Rick John. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm with the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we're a national policy and advocacy nonprofit organization focused on improving the health of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders living in the United States and its territories. We also engage in strategies to mobilize our communities and individuals to take action on important issues that impact health. We're based in Oakland, California, and we have an office in Washington, D.C. So as mentioned, the collection and reporting of disaggregated data has actually been one of the Health Forum's priority issues for nearly 30 years. We've been around for about 32 years, and we were actually founded in response to the famous Heckler Report in 1985, which was a report on the health status of minority communities by the then HHS Secretary Margaret Heckler. And in that report, the conclusion was that Asians and Pacific Islanders as an aggregate were healthier than any other racial group in the US. And as we've mentioned, because of the data that we now have, we know that this is not the case. And because of that initial report, our organization was created. And since that time, we've really been working with federal agencies to collect and report data on our communities in order to better understand the barriers and challenges that they face in accessing healthcare services. So just wanted to give some background to frame this issue and why it's so important to us at the Health Forum. Today, I wanted to provide just a brief update on what's been happening with regard to data disaggregation at the federal level over the past several years and efforts in that space to update the standards for the collection of race and ethnicity data. As you may know, the Office of Management and Budget within the executive branch of government is actually responsible for setting the standards for how race and ethnicity data is collected by all agencies of the federal government. And it's also responsible for coordinating the federal statistical system. This standard was last updated in 1997, at which time the API category was actually separated from Asians into a separate category of Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. So fast forward now, for the last couple of years, we came up to the time in 2015 where there's been a lot of work around the census and collecting better data to get ready for the 2020 census. In September of 2016, OMB, or the Office of Management and Budget, put out an initial call for comments in the Federal Register on its review of race and ethnicity standards, which was followed by for a second call of comments in March of 2017 on 4 specific areas of data collection. This came as a result of years of research and study on improving the collection of race ethnicity data, both by the Census Bureau and also a federal interagency working group for research on race and ethnicity that OMB established back in 2014. So throughout 2014 and 2015, the Census Bureau research team tested different question designs, gathered community feedback with the goal of improving race and ethnicity data collection, all leading up to the 2020 census. And this led up to the development of the 2015 National Content Test by the Census Bureau, which tested different methods for asking race and ethnicity and provided specific recommendations based on those findings for improving responses to those questions. So this was a great opportunity really to update the OMB standards, and in particular to increase disaggregation across all federal agencies for the Asian and Pacific Islander community. So with this opportunity, the Health Forum and other national API organizations mobilized our community to submit comments. We engaged in a mobilization and social media campaign, working with our community-based organizations in multiple states to get individuals to submit comments on the importance of collecting disaggregated data as a standard across the federal government. Through this effort, we were able to get over 3,000 people to submit comments in favor of the additional disaggregated data categories. And during this campaign, we also saw many comments against disaggregated data that Karthik mentioned earlier and that you'll hear more about from our next speaker. Next slide. So our recommendations in the comments that we and others submitted were to follow the recommendations from the U.S. Census Bureau 2015 National Content Test, which was a combined question with detailed checkboxes, which you see here on the screen. This format, when tested, resulted in the greatest number of responses from these ethnic groups. Now, based on all the comments and feedback that came in, the OMB was due to respond to comments and recommendations from the working group by December of 2017. However, they did not issue any recommendations or response after all these comments and analysis had been done. So this was really a huge missed opportunity, and one that has already impacted the 2020 census, which issued a decision that it would not be updating its race and ethnicity question because of no further guidance from OMB. And by law, the Census Bureau must deliver the decennial census questions to Congress 2 years before Census Day, so that was April 1, 2018. So based on all of this work that we've done to try to get an updated standard across the federal government, and now with no response from OMB as a result of all this work that has been done both by the Census Bureau and by this interagency working group, we're at this point where we're trying to decide, what are the next steps to improve and address what's happened at the federal level. So we, the Health Forum, along with the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, we've submitted a Freedom of Information Act request or FOIA request to OMB for the final report of the interagency working group with their recommendations to see, what was in that and why nothing came out of that in terms of changing standards. We submitted that in March, but we haven't heard anything back yet. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the OMB data standards. I also wanted to kind of mention that, at the federal level, there's also been other efforts to improve data disaggregation. I wanted to mention the Affordable Care Act. The ACA also included a new data standard section when it went into effect, Section 4302, which required minimum categories for all national population health surveys conducted or sponsored by the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level. And it included updated standards for race, ethnicity, sex, primary language, and disability status. For the race ethnicity category, this included 6 Asian categories plus an other, as well as 3 specific Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander categories plus other. And if you go to the next slide, or actually, sorry, the slide that was just on the screen, that shows the categories that are part of the OMB standard, the Asian categories, and then there's 3 categories that are also part of the NHPI standard. This actually shows what came out of the content test, and this is what we pushed for in our comments. So if you go to the next slide, I wanted to give an example of some of the information that has come out of what has been collected through the ACA 4302 standard. So this is a report that was put out by CMS last year showing enrollment data from the federal health insurance marketplace. It was published in April. If you go to the next slide, this provides an example of the type of detailed race and ethnicity data that can be used to see, in this case, who is enrolling in coverage. This was marketplace enrollment coverage for the 2017 enrollment year. And what this data shows is, with this disaggregated data, we can see what % of Asian consumers and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander consumers are actually getting coverage through the marketplace. This helps in getting information on what in-language materials might be prioritized. We can compare this data with American Community Survey data on the uninsured to see which groups are still not getting coverage. And we can also compare this with LEP data that Karthik had mentioned earlier. So just an example of how this data can be used at the federal level to improve health and healthcare services for our communities. Next slide. So what can be done right now with regard to advocacy for disaggregated data? First, we're continuing to push for implementation and enforcement of the Section 4302 standard that I mentioned earlier. Also, we can continue to raise awareness and support provisions of the Health Equity and Accountability Act. This was just officially introduced yesterday as a piece of legislation focused on health equity, and it includes a title on improving data collection. And actually, Section 4302 of the ACA came from early iterations of the Health Equity and Accountability Act, which was first introduced, as I mentioned, in 2012. So this is really an important bill for addressing disparities and improving data collection. And then finally, though this is not directly related to disaggregated data, there are efforts to push back on the citizenship question, which is set to be included in the 2020 census, and this is the first time that it will be included since 1950 on the census form. Again, we know that this inclusion of this question has the possibility to contribute to a very inaccurate count of our communities, and another way that our communities will not be as visible and represented as they should be. A comment period will be opening soon on the proposed topics and questions for the 2020 census, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights has actually held a webinar yesterday about this, and I can provide a link later, maybe through our follow-up materials, about more information on this area. So just wanted to give some, potential things that we can continue to do that are related to disaggregated data at the federal level to make sure that our communities are represented. And with
Great.
that, I'll turn it back over.
Great, thank you, Ian. Let's go from federal issues and advocacy to a specific example in a state level that Professor Ramakrishnan mentioned earlier about Massachusetts legislative advocacy. So I'd like to introduce Wayne to talk about this. Wayne Ye.
Great, thank you. Again, my name is Wayne Ye. I'm the coordinator for a group called APIC CAN, stands for Asian Pacific Islander Civic Action Network, and we're based in Massachusetts, and we're a coalition of AAPI serving civic organizations in Massachusetts. And I'll just be talking about the initiative for Asian American Pacific Islander data equity that was proposed in Massachusetts. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see the text of the proposed language that was put forth. And what you're looking at is the entirety of the proposed legislation, because this was a placeholder bill, and because it was rushed due to the deadline of the legislative session that this needed to be filed in, unfortunately, the legislator did make a typo in the title. So it does say here aggregate data, although we were advocating for disaggregate data. Unfortunately, this mistake and oversight led to miscommunication, and people that were in opposition sort of capitalized on this. But at the core of what was being proposed, if you look at this text, it's actually a very modest bill, because we were advocating for the state of Massachusetts and all government agencies which already collect race and ethnic data in public departments to adopt the race and ethnicity identification standards that are used by the U.S. Census Bureau. So that would have affected particularly the Southeast Asian community in Massachusetts, which was groups that we wanted to uplift, and particularly the Cambodian Khmer community, because as ethnicity data is currently recorded, Cambodians are simply listed as other Asian. So with the next slide, we'll take a deeper look at what was proposed in this H3361 bill. And as I mentioned, this would have affected all state agencies to collect racial and ethnic data. And contrary to some of the misinformation and fear that was spread out there, this was not a registry in any shape or form. In fact, with the privacy laws that already, with federal regulations for the census, for example, there is no linking information between an individual and what they respond as their race or ethnicity. In fact, this would just be putting the option out there so that each time a person goes to public housing, for example, or public services, education, or health, that we are able to give them the opportunity to self-identify not just their race, but specifically their Asian ethnicity. And next slide. So I'll be talking just generally about not just the legislative process, but also what our community's response was to this bill. As I mentioned, this was a placeholder bill, and the intention was for there to be, through the legislative process, for there to be more community engagement and lay out the details of how this would play out. Unfortunately, in the proposal of the bill and the timeline, there was not that much community engagement or awareness, even within Asian American community organizations and those that work directly within service agencies in the Asian American community, although the legislator had been talking with health advocates in particular. So throughout the process, this was initially proposed in January of 2017. And in the legislative process, it was assigned to the Committee on State Administration and Regulatory Oversight in the Massachusetts State House. So it was proposed and in the legislative system for a whole full year or so until it got more prominent attention, particularly by folks who were living in more affluent ethnic Chinese communities outside of Boston. And there was more of an opposition spread through WeChat, a messaging platform primarily used by the Chinese community that Karthik had mentioned. And so as such, the opposition had mobilized and spread a lot of misinformation. And we have also noted that some of the same folks were also against more progressive immigrant rights and sanctuary city policies. They had coordinated high-profile protests on Boston Common, outside of the State House, and gathered what they claim hundreds, thousands of signatures, but all while using misinformation and claiming an Asian registry, unfortunately. And for those of us that were in support of this, not just in progressive Chinese communities, but Asian communities overall, we noted that within the Chinese ethnic media, there was a lot of skewing of the messaging, and we really needed to reclaim our narrative and make sure that the reasons that we were advocating for data disaggregation weren't being co-opted. And actually, even in the words that we would use translated in Chinese to describe data disaggregation was not the same language or words that were used by people in opposition, because the words that were used, similar to the word disaggregation in itself, for people who don't work in policy or aren't legislators, or aren't working in academia, the word can sound like segregation, and they don't necessarily understand the importance of data. So for us, it was really about emphasizing data equity and the holistic picture of what makes up our AAPI community. So we did meet with legislators, and unfortunately, the opposition also met with some legislators who were progressive, and they ended up feeling the pressure of not wanting to touch a bill that they were afraid could make them seem racist or be portrayed as racist. So unfortunately, that did have that effect on legislators. And closer toward the beginning of this year, in January, the public awareness intensified, and we did hold legislative briefings and a lobby day at our state house, but unfortunately, the misinformation was spread so much within the overseas Chinese community that hundreds of people had come out on the January 30th hearing. And so next slide. I want to talk a little bit more about what our strategy was for, although we were out-mobilized and outnumbered, we were very principled in our coalition building. We made sure that we were cross-cutting issues as well as having a broad base of support within the AAPI community. We had groups that were grassroots advocates, community-based organizations, service providers, groups that worked in healthcare, legal advocates, academics, and even students. Since Boston has over 50 academic institutions, it was really important for us to reach out to faculty and students to come out and support and speak in support. And then what was really important was a lot of the opposition was saying, why is this only affecting Asian Americans? Well, quite frankly, Asian Americans are the community that we have been advocating for this. We have been advocating for this for decades. Yes, while this might be important for the Black and Latino community, we would like to know for themselves if they think this is what they need to advocate for at this time, and if it makes sense for them the same way that it makes sense for our communities. So as we would like to support the Black and Latino community to advocate for this, we also want to hear if this is what they need to prioritize right now. And in Massachusetts, when we reached out to the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus, we got their support. And they are interested in moving forward with this bill to consider including some of the Afro-Latino and Afro-Caribbean communities in Massachusetts as well, and expanding beyond Asian American communities. On the next slide, I just talked a little bit more, showing a little bit more about when we were planning a slate of panels, over 30 panels to testify at our hearing. The hearing lasted over 8 hours. From about 1 p.m. in the afternoon till past 9 p.m. And there were people that even came from out of state and testified and said that they are out of state. For us, we wanted to make sure that we had a broad range of different type of organizations, as well as people addressing the concerns that some of the opposition were bringing up. For example, there were connections to Japanese incarceration in World War II, and we did have members of the Japanese American Citizens League who were in support, and Japanese American individuals who were speaking about how their own family members were interned in internment camps, but they were still here supporting data disaggregation.
Hi, Wayne. This is Tung. I'm going to ask you to give us the outcome because we need to move on to the next presenter.
Sure. If you move on to the next couple of slides, just skipping through them, we focus on the narratives of what we were doing in groups that we were having show their support. And then the next slide is just sort of the tactics of people that were in opposition. And if you skip to the media coverage, just to show that we had different strategies, and then in two more slides after, just the general timeline of moving forward. The legislature decided to set up a commission that has until the end of this calendar year for us to make suggestions for data disaggregation. So we're hoping to continue moving on this and building a broad multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition in support of data equity more broadly than just the API community in Massachusetts.
Great.
And that's it.
Thank you very much, Wayne. And I want to finish the presentations with asking Suvan from CIRAC to talk about things we can do going forward. Suvan?
Great. Thanks, Dr. Tong. And thank you, Kate, for also having us join this webinar. So I, like was mentioned earlier, I run CIRAC's education initiatives at the federal and state level. And CIRAC, for those that are not familiar with our organization, we are a national civil rights organization that empowers Cambodian, Lao, Vietnamese, and other Southeast Asian American communities to create a socially just and equitable society. And we represent the largest refugee community ever resettled in the United States. And we are based in DC. And we've been working on data disaggregation for a very long time. We've been pushing efforts at both the federal level and supporting efforts at the state level to have it passed into law and implemented. Currently, we are running a campaign to protect and defend all of our state and federal data disaggregation efforts. We're having regular strategy and coordination calls that CIRAC convenes with actually all of the partners and speakers that are on this webinar today, in addition to state and local partners. A lot of the coordination efforts is focused on education policy. But we are tracking data disaggregation efforts in other policy areas. So if you would like to be involved in these coordinating and strategy calls, my email will be provided at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to give me send me an email, and I'll connect you with the rest of our partners that are working on this issue. And I think the last part I just want to emphasize is just some of the small things that you can do, and also just trying to underscore the importance of data disaggregation and the threats that we're facing. So, you know, for a long time, you know, we've been facing opposition from policymakers for implementing it, but now, as Karthik and Wayne and others have shared on this call, we're facing opposition from our own communities, which is unfortunate and would only further the disparities that we see in our communities. So it's really important so immediate next steps that would really be helpful in the long run is, one, for folks to engage and try to educate those that are opposed to data disaggregation, but also we see a need in educating our own communities, our friends, and our allies. As Wayne has sort of shared, right, that like some policy champions that are historically in support of our communities were a little hesitant to support data disaggregation. And I think part of that hesitation comes from just not knowing and not being informed and educated on the value and the need for data disaggregation for our communities. So as much as we need to be countering the misinformation that's been shared, we also need to be ensuring that everyone on our side is also informed and understands the need for data disaggregation. Other small steps also helps just sharing more information, things that you see on social media, right? Things that Karthik and API Data or Wayne and CPA Boston, things that we're all sharing. A lot of sharing on your own social media also really helps us. I'll leave it there and I'll turn it back over to Kate or to Dr. Tong to facilitate any Q&A.
Thank you, Suvan. I think this is just the beginning of the conversation about what we need to do going forward. I do want to give people a chance to ask some questions, so please type in your questions and Kate will forward to me. I have one that's already in the queue, and I think Karthik probably be the best person to answer this. The question is a two-parter, but I'll just maybe focus on the first one. In California, the goal was to collect disaggregated health information, but by the time the governor signed the bill into law, the collection was dependent upon funding. So how can we assure that public health and electronic health records will be standardized to collect the data? So not just legislatively, but maybe in implementation suggestions?
Yes, I mean, I think this, one theme I think you'll hear consistently is that we need to be better organized, so connecting researchers with advocates, with people who in government, and both on the elected side as well as the agency side, because even when the first year that data disaggregation went up in California, the health part of it was taken out of the bill because it was seen as too expensive, whereas the education parts were seen as less expensive to do. The next year it flipped because the political cost was higher than the financial cost. Throughout, what we've seen in conversations with people in the governor's office is they want to find out, they want to hear concrete examples of how this data has been useful or would be useful before it gets passed, and has been useful in terms of other efforts where data disaggregated collections have happened. And it's not, they don't want to just hear from academics, they want to hear from communities. So I think this kind of network that we build between the academic community world and the practitioner world needs to be strengthened, and it needs to be at the ready so that when people ask these kinds of questions, we can come up with evidence pretty quickly.
Great. Thank you. Next question. The question is for academic researchers, and this might go to Karthik again, but I'm not sure that it's only specifically for academic researchers. What should we be asking of federal agencies like the NIH or the CDC in terms of disaggregated data? Maybe I'll start with actually having Ian answer that question, and then Karthik maybe follow. Yep.
Yeah, so I think on that question, as I mentioned, there's the Section 4302 standard, which already requires all national population surveys conducted or sponsored by HHS to include these updated standards. So I think the first thing is to make sure that we continue to push for implementation and enforcement of the standard that's the law right now under the ACA. I think that's something that we can kind of make sure that both CDC and NIH are working and working under, making sure that those standards are in place. I think in terms of, just showing how that data is useful to show differences in our community is also important as researchers. But I think the most important thing is making sure that 4302 standard is being implemented and enforced.
Great. What are, just a follow up on that, what are some recommendations on how to start this conversation with community members? So I think what we're hearing is that we need to have the community engaged in all of this as well. So the opposition clearly has a way to reach the community that seems to resonate with some people. How do we talk to our community? And maybe we'll go to Wayne first, because you've actually had this experience most recently.
Sure. I would say that it's really a matter of speaking from heart to heart, and people are really concerned about their, the fear of their stability in this country. And given the current political climate, a lot of folks who even are on public services or public benefits, thinking that that their livelihood is at risk. And we just need to explain to people that for those of us who are represented well, like our data matches closely to the average that's presented by not disaggregated data, and for the average of Asians, that we have a role in uplifting other communities that are not seen and counted within this API umbrella.
Great. Any other presenter wanted to respond to that?
Yeah, Tung, I wanted to weigh in on this too. It's something that I think some of us we paid attention to this in California a few years ago, first when affirmative action was roiling through, and then basically when some of these activists started making the connection. And I think, as I've shown, it's not an accidental connection. It's very politically deliberate the way it's happened, and that ends up being really powerful. I wrote an op-ed in CNN last year around the time the Rhode Island mobilization was happening, arguing that community organizations, but all of us really need, whoever has the language skills to be able to get on WeChat and engage in those communities, we have to do it. WeChat has such predominant market share among the Chinese immigrant population that when academic research, advocacy research is not translated and engaged with in that medium, we leave the field uncontested and unchallenged for people that are pushing a very specific agenda but trying to mask it by really no substitute for us to be there in those spaces, both virtually and also the face-to-face as the ones that Wayne is talking about.
Okay, so I'm going to finish off. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and actually send one last message on this. I think what we need to tell people is that this is not a zero-sum game. The way that the opposition frames this is that if you do better for Southeast Asian or for affirmative action, then some other groups who are Asian lose. And our argument has always been that we need to work together to expand the quote-unquote pie so that we all benefit. So disaggregated data will help Chinese immigrants. There is no question in my mind if we argue for it appropriately. So it's not a zero-sum game. So I'm going to close by thanking our presenters for a great job of summarizing the issues and the challenges. And thanks to the API Caucus team for putting this webinar together. I hope this has been informative. However, I think what you're hearing from all of us is that I hope that it's to inspire everyone who's listening to find something to do to continue to fight for disaggregated data. Data is not a sexy topic to fight for, and the opposition is very motivated and organized, but this is fundamentally a fight for science against rumors and fake news and sectionalism. This is a fight for minority representation and visibility in an environment that is trying to erase diversity. So if knowledge is power, then disaggregated data is API power, and we need to make sure that everyone we serve who benefit, whether they're students, community members, families, anyone who can possibly benefit from disaggregated data must be a part of this fight. Thank you very much, and I'll give it back to Kate to close the webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tung, for moderating today's discussion, and to all of our speakers for participating in the webinar today for this important conversation that we did want to highlight during API Heritage Month, and it helps us wrap the month up. For logistics, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be sharing a recording of the webinar as well as a copy of the presentation slides will be emailed to all of the attendees and posted on APIC's website within the next week or so. Again, if you'd like to get involved, please contact Suvan Lee at suvan@crac.org. And please be sure to follow and join APIC at API Caucus, and look out for our call for nominations, as Juan mentioned, will be on June 1st, and the deadline being around mid-July. So thank you all so much for joining today, and hope you have a great rest of the day.